Okay, well, wow, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us in this Zoom meeting. We have a really great presenter in Dr. Erin Bayne, and I'm sure it's going to be a great experience for us all. And as always, for me, talking about nature and just anything involved with nature is always an exciting experience. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentation. Before we get started, I'd like turn off my timer. I'd like Peggy to give us a land acknowledgement, and then I will introduce Dr. Bayne.
Thanks, Rick. So the Red Deer River Naturalists acknowledge the many First Nations and Métis who live and care for the traditional and ancestral territories in central Alberta. We strive to work with Indigenous peoples to protect our waters and lands with respect and commitment.
Thank you, Peggy. Now, Dr. Erin Bayne is a professor at the University of Alberta, where he runs the Bioacoustics Unit. This unit is focused on using sound recording technology to understand the cumulative environmental impacts of human activities on biodiversity. The unit studies behavioral, population, and community ecology of many species, but mostly birds. They do this by linking bioacoustics, remote sensing, and advanced analysis to map and model future scenarios for species. The lab strives to provide recommendations on how various vocalizing species react to various types of human and natural disturbances, with the goal of achieving better conservation outcomes. Dr. Bayne, along with his many students, postdocs, and staff, have published over 200 papers in areas related to biodiversity conservation. I'd like to welcome Dr. Bayne to our special speaker series.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. Let's get my screen up here. Okay, I assume everybody can see full screen. Excellent.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, so as I was just saying, today we're going to do kind of a little bit of everything. We're going to do a little bit of physics. We're going to do a little bit of bird anatomy. We're going to do some bird behavior. And then we're going to start talking a little bit about some of the technologies that I've been using to improve our ability to understand birds, particularly in Alberta. And we'll kind of wrap up with some ideas, talking a little bit about how citizen scientists like yourself can participate with some of these new technologies in trying to help with avian conservation. So we're going to split the talk really into two sections. So the first, you're going to get a university, but more fun than a university lecture on bird acoustics. We're going to talk a little bit about what sound is, and I'll emphasize on why I'm doing this is to explain, by understanding the physics, you start to understand how technology can help us actually do bird monitoring and bird research better. We'll talk a little bit about how birds make sounds, and really this is somewhere of the natural history behind how birds work, and it's a fascinating area of study that I think probably is not something many of you have been introduced to. And then we'll get in a little bit into why birds make sounds. So what exactly is the purpose of song, and why are birds using it? And then once we've set that context about sound and birds and what they do with sound, we're going to talk about how we can actually use sound in ecology and conservation to do things like measure the size of bird populations and how they're changing. The timing of migration, we were all just talking about, has anybody seen any birds yet? Well, sometimes, you might not even see them, but you might be able to hear them. And we can talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about breeding behavior, space use, and a bunch of other things. And again, wrap up with showing you guys some tools that we have that are pretty unique and new here in Alberta, where we're kind of the leaders in the use of bioacoustics to help in environmental decision making and on bird monitoring and those types of things. So bird songs are sounds, but what exactly is sound, right? I'm talking to you, I'm making sound. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a disturbance as a wave, and that is what's called a longitudinal wave, and it's traveling through the air. And what that means is every time I talk, I am changing the air pressure in the room, and the air molecules in front of the air that I'm expressing from my lungs are vibrating, and they're vibrating in a wave like this longitudinal wave that you see at the bottom. And that sound moves through the environment until it reaches, basically hits a tree, hits a piece of water, and then that sound gets absorbed. Or that sound, that wave, travels out from in any direction from the source that made it, your voice, a bird singing, whatever the case may be, until it hits somebody else and their ears. And their ears take that wave information and the vibration of the air molecules with little hairs and other elements of our ears and turn it into information. And so sound is one of the most powerful mediums for communicating over long distances, a whole amazing amount of information. One of the things we're going to learn about tonight, though, is that the properties of these waves, right, are really dependent on the way a bird sings, the bird's size, all kinds of things. But what's really important to remember is the way that you make sound and the way you perceive sound is very different than the way a bird makes sound and perceives sound. And so this is one of the things that we often forget in our daily lives, is we can't always see the world through a human lens. We have to remember that other animals don't work the way we do. And so their perception of these things like sound can be quite different than ours. So how birds make sounds relative to us. So this is just a little bit of anatomy 101. Here we have the human respiratory tract. We have the lower and the upper. And we all know where our lungs are, and then we have our bronchi, and that moves up into a place called the trachea. Unfortunately, anybody who's been getting COVID, these are the things that get infected and things like that. But what's important is when we make sound, we do this through a place in our respiratory tract called the larynx. Okay, and the larynx sits right at the top of your trachea. So if you feel right here on the bottom of your throat where your Adam's apple is, your voice box is right near the base, kind of around where your clavicles are coming together. And what's happening when you make sound and you hear me talking is that I have air that's being pushed up through my trachea. My vocal cords are changing their tension and the opening size, and they're allowing the air to come out in different bursts of amount and volume that's creating that wave that's then moving through the environment. But what's really important is in all mammals, the voice box and the vocal cords and the sounds, they sit right at the top of the trachea, or so really quite close to our mouth, okay? So when a mammal makes a sound, it uses its vocal cords, the shape of its mouth, and its tongue, all to change that way that the air is moving out and is making these different kinds of sounds that you are hearing me make. Now, birds are very different. Birds, they have what's called a syrinx instead of what's called a larynx. And the syrinx, what's most fundamentally different about it is that it sits right at the base of the two bronchi. So coming out of your lungs, right, there are two bronchi, which are big, massive tubes, right, which carry a lot of air. But in birds, right at the top where those two bronchi come together is what we have what's called the syrinx. So it, instead of being at the top of the trachea, is at the very bottom. Now, why is this important? Well, birds can make incredibly fast, incredibly refined sounds, very short notes, very quick notes. We're going to look at that in a bit. And a lot of that amazing control and the beauty of the song that you can hear comes from the fact that they have these two areas where the wind is coming, the air from the lungs is coming back out and is able to make different sounds simultaneously. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Their tongue in the mouth of birds does very little. What really matters is this area here called the tympanic membrane. And it basically vibrates. It has different levels of tension, different levels of opening size. that are also influenced by something called an air sac. So all of these things work together to let birds make the sounds that they do, which are so much more rapid, quick, and at a much wider frequency range than anything a human being or any other mammal can do. So it really is a very unique adaptation that birds have to actually achieve this. Now, I talked a little bit in that last slide about this concept that was called an air sac. And you might go, what the heck's an air sac? Like, why does anybody care about what an air sac is? Well, birds are amazing animals in a million different ways. And I have hours and hours of lectures of all the cool things that make birds way cooler than mammals. In fact, I have a competition in the university to make more students like birds than mammals than my mammal colleague. And so I'm always trying to find the coolest things about birds to tell people about. But birds have these things called air sacs, and a lot of people don't know this, but birds breathe completely differently than mammals. Okay, so on the top here, we have a human being doing what's called bidirectional breathing. Okay, so what you do through your nose and your mouth is you breathe in air, and that fresh air has oxygen in it. It comes into your lungs. The oxygen is absorbed into the bloodstream through a bunch of capillaries in your lungs. And then those same, the blood vessels then also release the carbon dioxide from your blood back into the lungs, which you then exhale. The problem with that method is it works fine. You can breathe, we get the oxygen we need, but it's not very efficient because you have a mixing of carbon dioxide and oxygenated air all of the time. Birds are way more efficient. Now, because they fly, right, they need way more oxygen and they need it to be way more efficient. So birds have what's called bidirectional breathing, unidirectional airflow. And what that means is they actually have lungs, but they also have what are called air sacs. And air sacs act like a bellows that really do influence the ability of birds to make incredibly loud sounds as well, okay? Because birds can express, and sing at very high levels, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But how this unidirectional flow of air works in a bird is like this. Basically, every time a bird is breathing, it has two breaths in its body at the same time. So a bird inhales, and that air goes down the trachea, but it doesn't go directly to the lungs first. What it does is it goes to these air sacs that are highlighting in yellow here. So the first breath of oxygenated air goes to these abdominal and anterior air sacs that we see here. It sits there for a second while the bird then exhales. When it exhales, that breath goes into the lungs. In the lungs, the oxygen gets taken up, carbon dioxide gets switched back in, and then the bird inhales again. And when it inhales again, more air comes to the abdominal air sacs, but that first breath that we were talking about gets forced out of the lungs into what are called the intraclavicular air sac, the pneumatic air sacs, and these are all kinds of cool adaptations that birds have. But this air, now it's stale air, has gone into a new set of air sacs until the bird breathes again, and then boom, the air goes out. So there's this two breaths always in the system of a bird, making sure that they always get oxygenated air in their lungs at all times. Now, what's pretty cool about this is these air sacs are throughout the whole body, and that's partly what makes birds so light, but it has two other really cool adaptations. They go into the arm bones of birds. So if you actually ever saw a raven or an eagle with a broken wing, if you plugged its nose, it would still be able to breathe, but it would be breathing through its upper arm, through the break in the bone. Something that, of course, you would never think of, but yes, birds can breathe through their bones. So there we go. There's one of the cool things you tell your friends and neighbors. That's just bizarre, but it is really cool. But this intraclavicular air sac is the one that I really wanted to get to in the story, is that it sits around the syrinx, and how much air it has in it influences the way the birds make the sound, because it influences the shape and the way the syrinx is actually structured. Now, this is a video that is just to show you kind of how different birds make sounds. So this is a video of a series of different species of birds and how their syrinx moves to actually create different kinds of sounds. We won't watch all of it because it's about 2 minutes, but I'll show you a variety of things here. So this is a pigeon, and this is a pigeon making a cooing sound, okay? And what you're seeing there is the actual This is the actual syrinx and the motion that is going through in terms of the air coming out, right, and making that sound. Now we're going to look at an elegant crested tinamou. Again, this is slowed down 133 times, so you can imagine how fast it is. But this is a bird making a completely different set of sounds. Here's a ringdove. And this is making like a bloop bloop sound, right? And what you're going to see is this big pulse. And that big pulse of air is changing the sound. And all of the shapes that you're seeing here of the syrinx changing its position, changing where the length, all of this stuff is what lets birds make a variety of different sounds. Now, just to show you this syrinx component one more time, right here. So here we're looking as an oscilloscope, and there's the two bronchi coming together. And what you see is it's wobbling on both sides. And this is what lets birds make very unique sounds. So we'll get back to that in just a second. Now, okay, so we got this thing called the syrinx. We got these cool lungs. All right, but how do birds actually use them? Well, here's one of the coolest things I think I've ever heard about birds in my life. This is a wood thrush, and here's what a wood thrush sounds like. Okay, quite rapid song, very pretty, right? A lot of different notes, a lot of different structure. Well, what we have on the bottom here, this is what's called a spectrogram. And this is what's called frequency on the y-axis. And on the x-axis is time in seconds, okay? And what this shows, the darkness of this shows the notes of various that the bird is making, okay? Now, what you would see is when you would usually look at this, you'd say, okay, there's one species of birds and he's making that note, that note, that note, that note, that note, that note, kind of really constant and similar. And here's another bird making a completely different sound. Usually you'd be right. But in the case of the wood thrush can actually sing two things at a time at exactly the same time. Because at the syrinx with these two bronchi coming together, they actually have two pipes and one side makes one sound and one side makes the other sound that comes together to make what you see and hear as what sounds like one song and one sound, but it's actually two different independent voices speaking at exactly the same time. No other animal can do that. Now here we have the whooping crane, okay, and this is what a whooping crane sounds like. Big bugling type of sound. Now, it happens over what's called an amazing frequency range. So you heard both a low sound there, it's called resonant sound, and then here's some very high pitched components. Happens super quickly, like within about half a second. But how the whooping crane does this is quite amazing, is that they can get that really low sound because they have an incredibly long trachea. So in most birds, the trachea is pretty much the same length as the neck. Now, whooping cranes have a very long neck, but their trachea is actually almost as long as their entire body. And what it does, this is the trachea, and this is what's called the sternum. And these bones are right at the front of a bird. And what the trachea does, it actually wraps up inside of itself. And there's about 1 meter of trachea nested within inside of the sternum of the bird. So what this whooping crane can do is they can make really high pitched sounds, or they can make really, really low pitched sounds that broadcast a super long way by changing the position and the angle of this super long trachea. Now here's another bird. This one lives in various parts of the southern hemisphere, and it's called the southern casserie. Now, playing this one, you might go, he's not really playing sound, but listen really carefully and you might feel it. Here it comes. Nope, not quite. It is coming. Oh, sorry. Pushed the wrong button. There we go. Not that high one that you hear at the top, just that really low thing. So that is a southern casserie. And to give you an idea, that sound is at the base of human hearing. It's about as low a thing as we can possibly hear. And most of the time you don't really hear it, you kind of feel it. So just to put this in context, On this spectrogram with the wood thrush, the sounds are in about what's called the 2000 to the 6000 kilohertz range, which is the optimal place for human hearing. The whooping crane that we were looking at, its sounds are going from about 200 up to about 10,000 hertz. And the southern cassowaries, its sounds are about approximately 30 to 50 hertz, which is so close to zero. It's basically like a feeling. And what's really interesting about this is we don't know how they make the sound at all. We know that it involves the syrinx and the lungs, but how does it get to be so low? Well, the cassowary has this funky thing on the roof of its head called a casque, and nobody knows what it does. But when you cut it open, it actually is this really large hollow space. And from what we can tell, we think this may be actually linked to the way that they actually make this vocalization. But unfortunately, no one's been able to prove it. But this has long been thought to be one of the ways that dinosaurs also made very long distance sounds that would travel super, super far distances. Now, I've talked a lot about the syrinx and the lungs and how those make sounds, but that's not the only way that birds make sounds. So this is a bird called the club-winged manakin. Hopefully everybody can see the video here. It doesn't sound like the sound is playing very well. Oh, that's because it's muted. I'll do that again. Now you might think that's a vocal sound, but that isn't. And we'll play it one more time because we didn't get to hear that very well. We'll replay. What that sound actually is that bird beating its wings together at a rate, whoops, sorry about that, faster than a hummingbird can beat its wings. And so this is part of an entire set of displays that manakins do that they actually can beat their wings so fast they make that very, very high-pitched sound. And see, this is what are called mechanical sounds, and lots of birds make them. And we're going to talk a little bit more about a couple species in Alberta later on that make those kind of sounds, and we'll learn about what we can learn from them from that. But manakins, again, very cool in that they can move their wings at rates that, that was a very high-speed camera that let you see that. Basically, if you would have used your own regular video camera, all you would have seen was a blur, right? Like that's all it would have been. Now here's another classic sound that's not made by the syrinx per se. And this is the sage grouse. Used to be common in Alberta and unfortunately is almost extinct, but there are still some and we're doing our best to try and rescue them. But this bird is making that plooping sound, right? That doesn't come from its vocal apparatus. It doesn't come from the syrinx. What it comes from is those big yellow pouches on the front. And what those are is the air sacs. And in the grouse, what you have is actually part of their entire respiratory system sits just underneath the skin on the outside of the animal and can be used to make these really big, plooping sounds. And other birds also have very similar things, like sharp-tailed grouse have a similar type of way of making sounds as well. So again, not all sounds come from the syrinx. Some can be mechanical, some can be from external air sacs, but birds can make sounds in a lot of different ways. Now, one of the things I heard everybody asking is, has anybody seen any of the songbirds? And the answer, the songbirds, and somebody said something about ravens, for example, and ravens can't, make a lot of songs. Well, ravens actually are a songbird, and they have actually an incredibly diverse array of sounds they actually can make. A lot of times what we hear is that kind of boring, kind of grunty one. But if you ever follow them around for a much extended period of time, you'll find that they can mimic other birds. They can make all kinds of sounds that indicate different interpretation and different information. And that's because what they're known as is they're actually an ossine songbird, okay, the raven. And what that means is that they learn their songs after they hatch, okay? So they tend to be more complex, more variation between individuals, and they can adapt their songs to the local environment. And about 60 to 70% of the songbirds on the planet, about 5,000 species, are what are known as the ossine songbirds. Then there's a smaller group of songbirds known as the subausine, okay? And they know their songs at hatch, they're less complex, and there's less variation between individuals. And so what it is their songs are innate, they just know them, right? And ausine songbirds, they don't just know them, they have to learn them. So here's Canada warbler, beautiful bird that we have here in Alberta. Oops, sorry, I'm just having troubles with my screen there. Sounds like this. Incredible complexity, a lot of diversity. If you ever see a Canada warbler and then you see another one right by it, it won't sound exactly the same. Little bit different, right? They'll sing in a little slightly different way, and that's because they each learned a little bit differently. In contrast, here, this is called a subausine. This is the least flycatcher, very common bird in Alberta. Chebec, chebec. That's the sound it can make, and it's not very complex, and almost every individual does it exactly the same way. So when it comes to learning your bird song, really easy to learn subausines, not so easy to learn the ausines, because the ausines can be highly variable, lots of different dialects. Now, why that is, there is a genetic basis to it. There's a whole other bunch of components, but it really comes down as well to the musculature, right? Subausine songbirds have very few muscles in their syrinx, so they can't move it and adapt it in all those funky ways we were seeing in the video earlier, right? Whereas the ausines have much more control, much more fine motor control that lets them make those different kinds of sounds. Now, within the ausines, right, there's a continuum of different kinds of way of learning your song. Okay, so your typical house sparrow, it's what's called a closed end learner. What that means, the bird hatches, it spends its spring and summer kind of learning, it's growing, it's getting fed by mom and dad, it's listening to its environment, it's picking up on, what other birds are singing, what mom is singing, and what dad is singing, the sounds they're making. Autumn comes around, and what you'll hear in the fall, oftentimes you'll hear weird songs in the fall. It's like, what is that? I don't know. And what that is that's the young birds learning how to sing. They're practicing, right? They're trying it out, even though they don't really know what they're doing. They do that for anywhere from weeks to days, or days to weeks, even sometimes into months, till they've practiced it enough that they go, I'm happy with my song, I'm done. And that's what they then sound like for the rest of their life. So it's a 1-year thing. Then we can have, what are called zebra finches, right? And this is hatch. They have this sort of an overlapping period of sensory and sensorimotor where they practice and practice. And in about 90 days, they've crystallized their song and it never changes. Then there's groups of birds like the canaries who, they're hatch, they listen, they practice, they make a song, and then the next year they listen again. And they go, hey, I didn't like that last year one. I'm going to try something different. So they sing a slightly new song. And every year they adapt their song a little bit, and it gets more and more and more complex as the birds get older. Now, when taken to its extreme, you can get birds that can learn for their whole lifetime and learn sounds that are well outside of what we would ever perceive as being birdsong. So here's one of my favorite. This is actually, when you look at this, you kind of go, well, what's he about to say? But this is a songbird. This is the ultimate songbird. Okay, this is the greatest songbird ever in terms of the songs that they can sing. So this is called the lyrebird. It's the magnificent lyrebird. And this one is in a zoo and has watched a few too many movies. So tell me if you can figure out what movies you think this bird has watched. So what that bird did is it did a couple of different species of other birds that it imitated. This is what these birds, the lyrebird is a kind of bird called a mimic. And the lyrebird in that situation, it made a variety of sounds of other birds from Australia that were in there. Plus the bird, because it's lived in a zoo, has heard a lot of lasers and R2-D2, if you actually thought and listened close enough. It basically watched Star Wars way too much. If you look this up, the lyrebird on the internet, just go to YouTube, you will find lyrebirds that have been raised in zoos all over the world, and they've heard completely different things. They can make camera sounds, they can make chainsaw sounds, they can make hammering sounds, they can make, and what they do is they just sit and listen, and they create this massive repertoire. And that's part of how males get picked, right, from by a female, is the size of the repertoire. But it also just, it's something that influences sort of their success at breeding and a variety of other phenomena. But there are lots of other birds here in Alberta. We have the brown thrasher, which is a mimic. Doesn't do anything quite as cool as the lyrebird, but certainly can mimic sounds. We obviously, parrots are another example of birds that can learn to mimic sounds. The gray catbird can mimic some sounds, for example. So there's lots of species that have this ability to learn forever. And it can be, as I said, taken to some pretty cool extremes. All right, so that's how birds make sound. Why? Now, the biggest reason birds make sound is that acoustics is one of the best ways to communicate information, right? You can use it at night. It goes around objects. It goes super far. You can change it really, really fast. It's pretty easy to locate, and it doesn't take a lot of energy to use, which is very different than visual, chemical, or tactile, which a lot of mammals and reptiles and amphibians use. Now, birds do have language when it comes to communication, and we often kind of don't think of that. We just go, oh, that's a beautiful song. And it's like, yeah, but it's a beautiful song and it means something. And what we're trying to do as scientists figure out all the time, what does it mean? What are they using it for? So what I'm going to do is walk you through some examples over the next little bit of, kind of what you can do with that. So this may seem this is a chicken, so it's not too exciting, but the chickens are a really cool bird. And this is the structure and these spectrograms that I talked about. And this is what the different things mean. So these are 6 sounds that chickens make. This is a continuous, high-pitched, harsh, and what that means when a chicken does that, it means there's an aerial predator over top. It's communicating that information. If it gives the same thing, but it's segmented, that means it's a ground predator. And in fact, the reason that it's segmented like this, we'll talk about it in a second, but it's actually telling other chickens which way the predator's coming from. Then if there's a perceived threat, right, where you're not so sure what it is, you kind of use this kind of notes. If you're relatively happy and content, you might cluck. If you're crowing and you're really proud and want to express it, your notes look like this. And then if you use these segmented, you're actually telling other animals where there is food. Now you might ask, well, why are these all like this? Well, this is really a fascinating phenomenon in birds. This is a reed bunting, a blackbird, a great titmouse, a blue titmouse, and a chaffinch, all completely different species in Europe. And this is what's called the spectrogram of an alarm call. And you can see they almost all look identical, right? And the reason they almost all look identical is this is the sound that a predator cannot locate. They can hear it, but they cannot locate where the bird actually is. So almost all birds have evolved on this alarm call structure. And when they give it, almost all other birds know, oh, there's a predator around, I got to watch out. But the predator can't locate this sound because of the physical structure of it. In contrast, here's what's called a mobbing call. And this mobbing call, this is actually given by chickadees, for example. This structure has a very high frequency range. It's really short and they give lots of it. And what happens as a result of that is that the birds can actually communicate exactly where they are. So the other birds can rush in and go, okay, I'm here to help. What do you need, right? And all the birds can figure out where each other are. So what you're seeing here from the chicken is this kind of sound is, I don't want you to know where I am. These kind of sounds, the clucking and the food, those are, hey, I'm over here, come find me, right? And that's what we use for how when we hear it, those kind of notes are easier to find. Now, body size is a really big determinant of how far you can communicate, but it depends on the environment. So just to give you a sound here, this is really might be very annoying, so I warn you now. Okay, that's a sound at 4,000 hertz. And my audience is a bit older, so you may not have heard that one sound because that was at about 10,000 hertz. All right, those two sounds are exactly the same loudness, okay, but they're different frequency, right? You heard the second one and it sounded quieter to you than the first one, but it's not. It's exactly the same loudness. It's just your perception of how loud it is different. And what this is lower frequency sounds can travel a lot further than high frequency sounds. And that's related to body size. The bigger your body size, the lower the sound you make generally, the higher your body size, the higher frequency sound. So this has a really big influence on how much energy a bird has to put in to be heard, how far their sound is going to travel. But what's interesting is that different sounds travel different distances. So we've done a bunch of experiments, and I'll explain why in a little bit, but to understand how many birds there are, you have to be able to count how far away they are from you, right? Like, is there 2 birds, 3 birds, 4 birds? And are they within 10 meters of me or 20 meters of me or 100 meters or 1,000 meters of me? And what we've been trying to figure out is exactly what these relationships look like. And what's interesting is it depends on the environment. If you're on a road, bird sound travels a lot further than if you're in the forest. And this has really big implications for how we count stuff. And I'll come back to that later. So one last thing on just making sure that we understand how birds you make sound. You also have to remember how birds receive sound. Now, a lot of people, when they look at a bird, they go, where the heck are the ears? And the answer is they don't have external ears. Birds have very good ears. And this is an ear of a barred owl right there. So there's the opening into the ear canal, and you had to just move the feathers away to actually see it. Absolutely no birds have external ears. This is a great horned owl. These are not ears. These are just feather tufts. Okay, so they're little bits of feather that stick up. They do help with directionality a little bit, but it's not like the human earlobe, right? Which is part of its role is to help us condense sound. So birds have extremely good hearing, right? They have as good a hearing as us in some ways and much better than us in other ways. They hear about the same frequency range that we do, but they actually can detect much shorter sounds. So like when notes are really, really close together, like I'm talking really fast here, but you can still tell the words apart. A bird could talk 10 times faster and still be able to understand what was being said, essentially. Now, one of the things about birds too, especially owls, is their ability to locate sound is incredibly good, right? And owls do it by having what are called asymmetrical ears. So here's one ear on this skull, and here's the other one. And what you can see is they're not exactly on the either side of the head. They're what's called asymmetrical, so they're slightly off. That's actually incredibly good for owls because that means sound arrives at one ear earlier than it arrives at the other ear, and that makes it way easier for them to locate where a sound is coming from. So if you put an owl in a completely dark room, let a mouse run across, that owl can actually leave its perch and hit the owl in complete darkness because its ability to triangulate and figure out the exact position of the mouse from the sound is so much better than any other organism on the planet. Okay, so that was a lot about bird biology. And now can I do a little bit more of a quicker run through of sort of now that we understand how birds work, some of the cool parts about birds and bird biology, how do we use the sounds that they make to help understand their ecology and their conservation? So the first thing is I have ears, I can use them, but I have this one fatal flaw. I'm really good at, I like my birds, I'm pretty good at keeping track and knowing who's who, but I need food and I need sleep. And so I can't be out in the woods all the time counting birds. But recently technology has changed that lets us put out these devices called autonomous recording units or ARUs, and they've become our digital ears. And unlike us, they can stay up 24/7 and all they need is a battery for food, and they can record all of the sounds in the environment as long as we want them to. And this has kind of revolutionized our ability to understand birds. So one of the things that I just want to get across is when you stand in one place for a really long time, there are way more birds than we think there are. Okay, so you guys are talking about going for a walk. You're going to go for a walk for an hour, and I'll put money you guys might find 30, 40 species. Okay, this is a wetland up in northern Alberta. I put out an ARU out here for 45 days. And then I had this wonderful gentleman named Alex, who's a very young, wonderful guy, listen to it every single day for multiple hours per day. And when he listened one time, he found 9 species. The next time he found one more species. The next time he found another one. Then it was a few hours later before the recording device turned on, he found 5 more. By the time we were done listening to this place, right, this one place in Alberta, we had gone from hearing 9 species to over 60. And the point is, if you spend enough time there, a lot of birds will come through a place and vocalize and give you cues that you can actually do. And this is really important because our understanding of birds in Alberta is based on people doing, I'm there for 5 minutes, this is what I heard. And that's what they then conclude how important a place is or things like that. Well, you really can't do that unless you have a really good understanding of, over time, how many bird species do you hear. Now, the problem is Alex is young, but if he listened to all the recordings I already have made of Alberta, he'd be 162 when he finishes all the data I have. So I can't do that anymore. I got to figure out new ways, or I'm going to have to get a bunch of Alexes before I retire to get this all done. So rather than listening, right, one of the things we're trying to do in my lab is change the way we get data out of these sound recording devices. Now, hopefully everybody could hear that one and recognize it. That's a ruffed grouse, very common in Alberta. This is the spectrograms we've been talking about, and this is the actual sounds that a ruffed grouse makes, and that's what they look like on a spectrogram. So that's the beating sound of their wings, right? Well, what we're going to do now is we're all going to do a little experiment here, right? I'm going to click a button, and we're going to process 10 minutes of data in 7 seconds, all right? So you guys have to watch very carefully on the screen. But what we're doing is we're visualizing a minute of sound in about 0.7 of a second. And then what I want you to do is, how many times do you see a pattern something like this? All right, so here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How many ruffed grouse calling did we have in those 10 seconds? You can throw it in the chat if you want. We'll see how people did. How many times there were ruffed grouse in those images? Doesn't matter if you're wrong, type in a number. 10, okay. 3, okay. Well, Rick, you don't have a job. Beth, you're hired. There was 3, so great. All right. The point of this, right? Yeah, there might even somebody's got 4. It's very good. I mean, it all depends on what we're counting in here. But my point is, we can process huge volumes of data this way by taking the sound and turning it into vision. So this is one of the benefits of vision. We can do it really quick. Sound you have to listen to, right? So we've processed somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1 million recordings this way. So we get huge more volumes of information about where birds are, how abundant they are, things like that. Now, the other thing we're trying to do, Ellie, my former grad student, did an amazing job of, we saw those pictures, right? We could see them. We could see the pattern that was the ruffed grouse. So the question is, what can't we could we not train a computer to do it? Okay. And what Ellie's been working on is trying to take those images that I just showed you, and just like if you have Google Photos on your phone, right, and it can recognize your face and your kid's face and your grandkid's face and all that other stuff, what it's been doing is you've given it, the computer, a whole bunch of images that it says, okay, I'm starting to understand what your face looks like, and it can start to identify you. Well, the same thing works with spectrograms. So if we take the visual representation of a sound, computers can actually start to now look for that sound and be able to search through it. So what Ellie's been trying to do is train computers to recognize nighthawks. This is a nighthawk up here, and these are the sounds. These are called peat sound. But what Ellie's learned, and one of the most fundamental things, is if a bird is really close to the ARU, you can train a computer to do this, no problem at all. In fact, it works great. The problem is when the bird gets further and further away, it gets harder and harder to teach the computer what the pattern looks like. And so what she's been showing is how you train it matters. And what ends up happening is the distance at which, right, the bird has a really big influence on how well the computers can do. So at really close distances, computers have this nailed. So if you guys have heard about things like BirdNet or Merlin from Cornell, they're tools that you can use where you go out with your phone, you record the bird, and it'll say, I think it's this. We've been working on those things too. And those tools work great if you get a really good recording at a really close distance. They'll work almost 100% of the time. The problem and around the science and what we've been working on in the lab is when the birds get further and further away, how do you actually make that work? And that's the hard part. And that's what we're still working on. That was a black-throated green warbler, one of my favorite birds up in northern Alberta. And one of the things, though, about what I just talked about is when the bird's really far away, the computer can't do much with it. So what we've been able to demonstrate, though, is that if you really do want to make recognition work, or you really do want to figure out where birds are, having more ears is better. So what this shows is this. Here's the bird singing, and those are the sound waves we just talked about traveling out to those ARUs. And you saw each one of those sound waves arrived at a different ARU at a slightly different point in time, right? And that's because sound travels at a fixed rate. And so if a bird sings, it's going to arrive at the closest ARU first, the next closest ARU a little bit later, and the third ARU a little bit later after that. And what we've been able to demonstrate is that we can take that data, we can make spectrograms of all of the different ears that we have out there, and I can actually figure out exactly where that bird sings from. And we've been able to do it down to the meter. So I can actually, if I have multiple sets of ears in the environment, figure out this is the exact tree that the bird is singing from. So we're going to take this technology now and take you on a quick whirlwind of how we're applying this to ecology and conservation in Alberta. So this is another one of my favorite birds. I've studied this bird for over 25 years. It's called the ovenbird. It's a neotropical migrant that migrates from Mexico, South America, Central America more so, up to Alberta every year to breed. And with all these ARUs, we've now been able to put together an incredibly good understanding of how birds are reacting to different types of forest, different ages of forest, whether or not the forest was burned versus harvested, and how agriculture, forestry, energy, urban development are all influencing these birds. And that's really what we're trying to use this data for. How many birds are out there and how are they changing? And sadly, for way too many of the birds that we have in Alberta, they're changing a lot. So this is a map that we made of what ovenbirds would look like if humans weren't on the landscape in Alberta. And this is based on the habitat that they like. So what I want you to keep track of, we're talking red deer's around here, okay? Edmonton's around here somewhere. Up here, we're talking the Peace Country. So keep a track. The red is good. It's the happy place for ovenbirds. Blue is habitat that they don't like so much. We're just going to watch how much things have changed in the last 40 years. So this is what it would have looked like 40, 50 years ago. And we're going to watch this map change. And that's how much we've lost. And this is pretty striking. And I can show this for many, many species. Now, there are some species that benefit from the disturbances humans have made. And I could tell many stories about those as well. But it's this sound technology has really helped us be able to make these kinds of models because we can actually now fully understand how birds are reacting to all these different kinds of disturbances. Now, we were talking about migration earlier. One of the really cool things about these ARUs is I can now tell you exactly what day they arrive at what latitude. So this is latitude 54, that's around Edmonton. 60 degrees is the Northwest Territories. And basically, it takes ovenbirds about 6 days to get from Edmonton to the Northwest Territories border. So it's about a 6-day migration time on average that we see for most of our warblers to get from Edmonton red deer to the far north half of the province. Gives you an idea of sort of the time it happens. What's interesting though is then when they arrive, they go to certain habitat types. This is deciduous forest, mixedwood forest, and spruce forest. They go to those way earlier than they do black spruce, shrub, or pine. And what's interesting is that the birds actually arrive in these different habitats at very, very different times. And we didn't actually know that before. And what this tells us is the birds are actually competing to get to these environments. So all that singing and all that cool stuff that you're going to see in the next few weeks is about the birds fighting it out to get to the best places first. So the places where you start to see the birds first are going to tend to be the best habitats that those birds are going to be able, they're the ones they want to get to first. Now that was the olive-sided flycatcher. It's an endangered species in Alberta. And one of the things that we've been able to do with ARUs is we actually can figure out which olive-sided flycatcher males have been able to attract a female to their territory. So what this shows is the date, and this shows how often they sing based on an ARU. And what we see is that birds that are paired, that is a male attracted a female to his territory, they set up a nest and they, started a family, right? Their singing behavior looks like this over the season. It drops. The orange are the guys who they show up, they sing and sing and sing, and nobody comes. And then they sing some more and nobody comes. And they keep singing, but the ladies don't like them for some reason. And nobody shows up. And he'll sing like this all season long. And so what we're now using this to do is we're looking at these behavioral differences in singing rate to see if we can figure out what habitats, right, are birds less likely to be paired in than less likely to be paired in. And so we're actually being able to learn without ever seeing the bird what its reproductive success might have actually been. That's a Swainsons thrush. And one of the other things that's really cool about these ARUs is that we were learning a lot about differences in the southern populations here in Alberta and the very far north. Okay, so again, if we talk about Swainsons thrush around red deer, this is their seasonal singing pattern, right? So this is midnight up to about 4 or 5 in the morning, they don't sing. Then they have this really rapid increase between about 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, right? That's when they peak in singing. They go down in the middle of the day and they come back up at night and then shut up again. That's what happens red deer in Edmonton. If you go up to Northwest Territories, where the sun does set and it gets dark, right? But it doesn't get as dark, right? The birds are actually singing all night long. Now, what's really cool about that, we've also demonstrated that they're also feeding their young all night long. And so this technology of linking together, ARUs and cameras and a bunch of other stuff is showing us that the birds in the far north behave very differently than the birds in the far south, and they show really different reproductive strategies as a consequence. And we would never have known this without sound to be able to help us. Now, one of the things, when I talk about that triangulation thing, here's a mourning warbler, and this is actually an old well pad. This is an oil and gas well pad that's being reclaimed. And the oil and gas companies would like to know, we're reclaiming these, we're planting trees, we're doing stuff. Are the birds even using them? And so one of the things we were able to do with triangulation is figure out, yeah, the bird is exactly, right? He's singing on the well pad. And he's singing on the well pad more when it has new trees. But what we've been able to do recently is basically link drones and ARUs together to figure out exactly where the birds are singing. So these are the points that the birds sing that we get from these ARU triangulation. And the drone can fly over the well pad and actually measure the height of trees. So we can see that this particular bird happens to sing in the tallest trees on the well pad. Right? So we literally can actually now take these two technologies, combine them together and say, that bird is singing in that tree at that location, which is really revolutionizing our ability to talk a lot about the way these birds behave. Now, a couple of other last just stories to tell you. This is a common nighthawk, a bird that used to be really common in Alberta and still is, but only in the far north. It's kind of disappeared in the south. And this is the bird making the wing boom. So that's its wings making a mechanical sound, right? Nobody knew what it meant. And then here is the here's the bird. I'm having a trouble finding my sound icon. There we go. Making what's called its peat. So this is the peat. Hey, sorry, too many buttons. the peat sound. These two sounds, we had no idea what they meant for the longest time. But through this bioacoustic component, what we did is we actually put a recording studio on the back of the bird and a transmitter on the back of the bird. And we found out that they only make the wing boom sound when they're over their nest. They make the vocal peat sound everywhere. And so the vocal peat is a sound that they use to say, hey, I'm flying around, I'm looking for food, just watch out for me. But when they make the boom, they're saying, hey, this is my nest, stay the heck away, or I'm going to come over and beat you up. And we wouldn't have known this if we couldn't have used bioacoustics to help us understand, their behavior. A couple other last ones just to wrap up. This is the warbling vireo. Okay, and it has two subspecies, one called Eastern, which is known as the Gilvus, and one known as the Western, which is the Swainsoni. When you look at those, you'd probably say, those are the same species, Erin. What are you telling me they're different? Well, the answer is they're not different in the way they look, but they are different in the way they sound. Okay, that's the Eastern. That's the Western. Quite different, right? We can tell the difference, and guess what? So can the birds. Okay, though that's the structure of their notes. But what's fascinating is that is where those two subspecies are distributed in Alberta. They actually are those two birds look exactly the same, but there's two species. They will not interbreed. And the blue, right? This Eastern version is kind of what you're going to find when you're in and around the Red Deer area and further south. Whereas you head to the mountains and up into the boreal, you're only going to find this Western version or Swainsoni. And it's their song that keeps them apart. It's not their physical, right? How they physically look has nothing to do with it, whether they interbreed or not. It's their song keeps them apart. Now, people, there's a lot of us, and we're really annoying sometimes, and the birds know that. So one of the things about these ARUs is we're now trying to make linkages between what humans are doing and how birds are reacting. So we had all the habitat data I showed you before, but birds are they're experiencing a new soundscape like they've never heard before, right? They evolved in a world that other than themselves and frogs and other things, those were the noises of the landscape. Now they're dealing with vehicles, machines, airplanes, gunshots, you name it. And how that sound is affecting the ability to birds to communicate with sound is a really big open question. But Richard did a recent study where we used ARUs across Alberta, and he came up with one of the most scary statistics I think I've ever seen in my life. So this is a graph of latitude on the x-axis, and this is if you went on any recording at noon on any day randomly in the province of Alberta, and you listen for 1 minute, there's a 60% chance at anywhere at 49 or to 50 degrees latitude, or 50 to 51, or 51 to 52, that you would hear a human being anywhere in the province. So we are everywhere, and we are changing the fundamental ways that the soundscape sounds. Now, we still have some pretty pristine places called the Northwest Territories, border, right, where you're not going to hear humans very often. But birds are increasingly running into a world where the sounds that they are experiencing and having to interact with are human in origin. So that low rumbling you just heard and that bird singing, it's called the Lincoln sparrow. And we've been studying sort of how it behaves and how it reacts to noise up in the oil sands. This is a place with very low human noise, moderate human noise, and a lot of human noise. And what we found is that the Lincoln sparrow doesn't really care how noisy it is overall and doesn't really care about the low sounds. But if there's really high frequency sounds made by the machinery that's up there, they won't be in the habitat. The habitat could be there. It's perfectly good. They love it. It's got everything they need. But because it's noisy, they avoid it. They stay away from it. And we're starting to see this with more and more birds, that the amount of human noise in the landscape is changing where they're tending to be. Now, in the case of the Lincoln sparrow, if it's not high noise, what they've been able to do is they actually do care about the low noise, but they've actually been able to adapt to it. So what they do is they sing louder, they put more energy into it. So here is the noisy place. This is how much energy they're putting in. And this is how much energy they put in when in the quiet places where there's no human noise. And what they're doing is they're singing more. right? So the birds
Yeah.
in the really noisy places are having to sing a lot more than in other places. Okay, so to wrap up, everything I just showed you in terms of the data and all of those things, they're available to you through a website called Wildtrax. So I've been working all of the things you just saw with this huge team at the bottom. All of these recordings of all of these places in Alberta, which is tens and tens of thousands, places you may never get to that you'd love to hear, you'd love to see, you can come see on our website. Now, this Wildtrax website is a tool that lets people listen to data, identify the species on it, count the species on them, share data with other people. It also has a computer component where there's an artificial intelligence that helps you learn what some of the sounds are and things like that. And this is just to give you an idea. We're building this bigger and bigger all the time. And so soon, for those of you who don't have time to get to Prince Edward Island or Newfoundland, but you've always wanted to go there and hear and see the birds, I can't really let you see the birds, but I can let you hear the birds. You can hear birds from anywhere you want in Canada by coming to the website and going to places that you might not otherwise ever get to. So to wrap up, birds sound is amazingly diverse and wonderful. There's so much information in digital sound that can be used. And you know, you don't have to be a professional to use sound to learn about your environment. If you'd like to learn more about how you could participate in listening to this kind of stuff, just please send me an email or check out the website. And I'd just like to thank the birds and all of the people who've made this possible. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions.
Erin, Dr. Bayne, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I've certainly opened my eyes to all the various things you don't even realize is happening out there with the birds. And is pretty frightening about how they react to human sounds and the sounds in the environment.
Yeah, it's a pretty big, I mean, it's interesting in that, like I said, there are many species of birds that don't react well to it, but there are others that have adapted, which is interesting, right? And it's trying to figure out which birds can adapt and why. But it is one of the things that, you know, like there's a lot of things we can do about noise in the environment, spending money to make roads quieter. That actually can be done. Spending money to make the oil sands quieter, right? That can also be done. And it's just a kind of a question about how important is it relative to other, you know, influences and things like that. But, you know, a lot of you folks are from Red Deer and you're talking about, you know, you've probably all been to the Bighorn and on a June long weekend and know how many people are out there. And that certainly does have an influence on the birds and how they're going to use that landscape. For sure.
Exactly. So I'll just open it up to any questions.
Yeah, and we've got one chatted in by Myrna. Which species have declined the most over the past 10 years?
Sure, Myrna. Well, there's many answers to that question, depending, you know, where we're talking on the planet, for example. You know, some places, I mean, several species of birds on the planet have gone extinct in the past 10, 20 years. That's happened multiple times, sadly. In many cases, most of those tend to be on islands is generally where that's occurred. And that's because they're small populations, they're locally adapted, those types of things. Here in Alberta, some species that I think are of particular concern to Albertans, the sage grouse is probably the number one. It has almost been extirpated from southern Alberta. We've been putting it back, you know, with breeding programs and all kinds of things, but it's not been particularly successful. So that's one. There's a bird that virtually nobody knows anything about called the rusty blackbird, which has declined by over 95% universally, but because it's a blackbird, hasn't actually been listed as a species of concern. And so that's one that kind of drives me nuts that the government won't step in and do something about it. And unfortunately in Alberta, the only place that I've ever found it in any numbers is right up against the oil sands mines in an area that's likely to become a mine in the future. And so those are a couple of big, you know, couple opposite ends of the province type of extreme examples. The Canada warbler that I showed, its population's declined by over 85%. You know, and I could go, unfortunately, I could go on and on and on with species that have declined. But For everything that declines, there almost tends to be something that fills in a niche, right? But all those tend to be generalist species, right? So when some species decline, others will go up, but usually it becomes a much more limited number of species that do that.
Thank you. We've got another one here. With the knowledge that birds learn their songs, do the sounds change to mimic human noises in their environment? That's a question from Estelle.
Yes. Well, yeah. So for sure, Estelle, within what we were talking about earlier with the mimics, they certainly have the capacity to learn human noises and things like that. Now, a lot of birds, like your warblers or your chickadees, they don't obviously have that capacity to learn those sounds. But I was going to show an example, but I decided to take it out. But it's a bird and we've seen it in a couple species here in Alberta. But there's a really nice study in Europe on a bird called the great tit, which is really just a chickadee. And what they found was that in the rural environments, the bird would have a song that had a lot of song complexity with low notes going into high notes. When that same species lived in an urban park, they actually just stopped singing the low frequency notes because nobody could hear them anyway. They just literally went, this is useless. No one can hear it. So they stopped singing it. And so birds do have the capacity to adapt their song and adapt their singing behavior to some degree, but it does depend on, like I said, your ability to adapt, but the environment as well plays a huge role.
Thank you. So Joanne has a question. Do the birds at high latitudes that feed their young all night have young that are better developed than those at lower latitudes?
Yeah, great question, Joanne. And the answer is it does seem to have a benefit in that there's two main things that happen the further north you go. The breeding season is shorter, so you got to get done faster, right? Because you got to get up there, you got to breed, you got to get your young big enough to migrate again and turn around and get out of there before winter kicks in. And so what really mainly happens is they do it faster, right? They get out of there a little bit quicker. They're not really in any better condition than the southern birds, but they do it a little bit faster. And that's a real benefit for migration. The second part of it is, that's the main one is the timing of that. And some other thought I had in my head, but it kind of jumped. So I'll have to try to remember the second part of what I was going to say, Joanne. Can't remember.
Okay, thank you. Tony is asking, have you studied the effects of highway noise, such as the Queenie 2 by red deer?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Tony. So yeah, we actually have just started. So like most of my research on noise has been on energy sector facilities, so which we call chronic noise, right? Like, and they make noise 24/7. Things like processing plants, upgraders, what are called compressor stations, and they're all over up in northern Alberta. So I've studied that a lot, and birds definitely react to those. The highway component, I've just started working on it, but it's been done many other places in the world. And there's always been this concern that, well, is it really the highway noise or is it the cars going by that are hitting the birds? Or, like what's the actual factor that makes a road bad for birds? And so people have always wondered about that because roads just generally, there's way fewer birds of many species. There are some that love roads, but there are many that hate them. But there was a really beautiful recent study done where people basically simulated a road in the environment. So we took a bunch of speakers into the woods and made a really loud road in the middle of nowhere. And guess what? The birds avoided it. They didn't like it. So it actually is the noise, not just the cars going by, getting hit by a car, all that stuff, which is also important. But the noise itself does actually have an influence. And with the kind of volume that's on the QE2, it's a massive effect.
So Ina's curious, what's your second favorite songster?
Oh boy, yeah, well, that's a tough one. To be honest, I tend to go with the bird that got me into being a biologist. So my father's an engineer. I went to university thinking I'd be an engineer, but I had in the back of my head that maybe there was something you could do outside, and I didn't know what it was. But I was a kid when I was 12. I found a brown thrasher in the trees near my farm, and the brown thrasher is one of the birds. It's a mimic. And I was just standing outside. I don't know what I was doing, and I heard this thing singing. And I'm like, is that one bird? No, there's another bird. Wait, there's another bird. Wait, there's another bird. And I was like so confused, right? Until I walked in and found it and watched it and watched. I'm like, it just sang 3 or 4 different kinds of songs. That's the coolest thing I ever saw. And that was always rested in the back of my head after that childhood incident. It was like, maybe there's something I could do with that later. And I found it in university and never looked back. So that's kind of how it worked.
Erin, I have a question for you. Do you know the name Tony Erskine?
Yes, I know Tony's name very well.
Well, he's an old timer, an ornithologist, did a lot of work in Canada. He started the breeding bird surveys in Canada. Anyway, I talked to him not too long ago, and we were reminiscing about a lot of things. And one of the things he said, what was very definite in his memory, was that there used to be such a thing as dawn song. And I can tell you from personal experiences, when I was in the bush 50 years ago, there was a lot more widespread singing taking place in the boreal forest everywhere else. The place was alive with birds. You talk to some of the Aboriginals in Fort Chip and they'll tell you the same thing. When we used to go out in the bush, there was song everywhere. And now you have a hard, well, you hear them and you hear patches here and patches there, but the dawn song has disappeared. So that what suggests to me is not only in area-wise you have a reduction in numbers, but also densities where you have reasonably good habitat still left. So the numbers are way down from what they used to be.
Yeah, Lou, I've actually, I mean, I've had similar conversations with people over the years. And I mean, I can say, you know, even like I'm a bit younger than a few of you than you are, Lou, just by a little, but not a lot. And I mean, even from the time I did my PhD in Prince Albert National Park, that place is still a beautiful park. The habitat's magnificent. It's not got bad or it's changed, but it's not bad or worse. It's just new, you know, it's done what a forest does. And that species I studied is much less abundant. Absolutely. So a lot of that, I mean, these are these challenges we have in Alberta is how much of those declines are, quote, our fault from things we've done here. And those maps I showed you, those are the our fault part for sure, because that's, you know, the stuff that it's agricultural conversion, it's reduction of old growth forest due to forestry, it's oil and gas development, it's transportation, urbanization, all of those things, we lose habitat. And so if we lose habitat and the bird's habitat is not there, there's either one of two things happens. The birds decline or they have to go up everywhere else, right? And so then if that was case, you know, the stories that Lou would just tell would say, well, in good habitat, I'd be hearing 10 times more birds than I did before. And we don't, right? We're hearing less. So that suggests that even in good quality habitats that's remaining, we're not seeing increases, right? We're seeing decreases. So those decreases are being driven by something else. And those two main things are on migration, the number of places to stop over and fuel up and find food, that's a problem. Running into windows and cats on migration is a huge problem. And then when you hit the wintering grounds, there are places in the wintering grounds that in the last 30 years, we've lost 90% of the wintering habitat for species, like the Canada warbler, for example, one of those beautiful ones I just showed. It's disappeared primarily due to the fact that in the Dominican Republic, where its wintering habitat is, there's only a few valleys left that have trees. And so all the birds from almost all over North America are going to this one place. And so that's a huge issue.
I just have another question as part of this. I've been going to the same area every spring, just to sort of patching, you know, see what there is and what comes back. And there was one location at one point where I seen a Lecon's sparrow in a very specific habitat. And I come back every spring to the same location and I wouldn't see that. It was gone. It was a one-shot thing. And then after 5 years, that bird, a Lecon's sparrow, was seen at the very same spot. So the question to me was, how the hell would that Lecon's sparrow know that that's good habitat? Because 5 years is a long period of time. I mean, chances are that whatever was there before didn't come back 5 years in a row. Well, maybe they did. And if they didn't, maybe there was some genetic connection that brought some offspring back into that location. Which is it? Is it something that the habitat sort of reflected? This is good Lecon's habitat, or was there a genetic connection that brought it back to the same spot?
Sure. Well, so there's a lot of parts to that, Lou, and I mean, I'm only going to be able to be speculative in this current answer, but let me give you a couple of examples. So the migration, you're all so excited and pumped for it. All these birds coming back. The birds that are coming into what we call their after second year. So they're coming into basically their their second year of life. All right. So they were hatched, let's say they were hatched in the year 2021. They migrated to the wintering grounds for 2022, right? And then that bird, we have no idea where it's going to go. Honestly, they'll go within about 100 kilometers of where they were hatched, right? Something like that. I could explain how we figured out about 100, 200 kilometers, but that's the area over which most birds will tend to come back to the place where they hatched. But that species of bird I studied called the ovenbird, I studied it for 5 years, and I caught them and I put bands on their legs so that I could tell who was who. And my favorite story to tell was one day, and I think it was June, yes, it was June the 11th, and it was 9 o'clock in the morning. I put up 2 nets and I used the variety of ways that we use to catch birds. Boom, these 3 birds hit the net, bang, bang, bang. I put bands on their legs. I did my studies on them that year. I let them go. I came back exactly 1 year later. It was 11 o'clock in the morning, and I set up the nets in exactly the same spot. And I pushed play on my tape deck to try and attract them to the net. And boom, 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 I caught 3. And they were the exact same 3 from the year before. Most songbirds, if they're breeding, if they successfully breed, come back to the exact same place, like exactly. And then if they do that, and as they get older, they can get more ritualized. So, you guys like your chairs and sitting around in chairs. Well, birds are like that. Even if it's not the greatest place to be, they'll keep coming back and back and back. But in your case, if you had a skip like that, Lou, it's very likely that it's not the same bird, right? Like that bird was there, it lived, it went there, it bred, it then died. There wasn't enough LeConte sparrows to find it. But those juveniles I just talked about, right, they come back to about 100 kilometers. What we think happens a lot in songbirds in the boreal forest is that the young don't necessarily leave on migration super early. They spend a little bit of time in the late summer, early fall flying around trying to find places to come back the next year. And so we have seen that in certain species where the juveniles, they explore away from their nest, maybe a kilometer, 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers, 20 kilometers, and then they come back to that spot. So it's probably a bird was exploring, right, during that period of time and then happened to find that piece of habitat. But exactly how birds who've never been to some place find these really good habitat patches is really one of the most misunderstood. We don't really know how they do it exactly, but they do find it because they can fly.
Oh, thanks. That's a good answer.
Thanks, Erin. I think that you've answered all the questions in the chat and the raised hands, and it's been a bit of a marathon talking for you. So thank you for a fascinating presentation. We had some thanks chatted in the chat box as well, and people said that they were going to go and check your Wildtrax website.
Yeah, for sure. And just on the Wildtrax thing, like Wildtrax right now, it when you first look at it, it's going to be a fairly sciencey kind of thing, more for scientists. But where we are going to go with this is we really would like to encourage people, as we get more and more and get a few tools built into it, to be able to listen, as I just said, which that's coming more and more, as well as like if you did want to get involved in doing like sort of your own little research project. I have 162 years worth of data. Go for it.
Wow.
Okay, I think, Chris, did you have a question? No?
Okay, well, I think many thanks to Dr. Bayne, and it was a definitely wonderful presentation. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending this speaker's presentation. And we will be sent, I don't know who's our next presenter next in April, but we will send that out. And I'd especially like to thank Dr. Bayne because I understand he had a pretty sick family. So to come out and give us this presentation is especially thoughtful of you. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you very much. Stay safe, everybody, and thanks everybody for coming.
All right. Then
bye.
That's it. We'll adjourn and we'll see you next month.